Goat versus fish. Fish might win or goat. Fish might win or goat. Will it be goat? Will it be fish? Will it be goat or fish in this quick, rapid versus of goat versus fish? You're going to go with goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. We've got a goat in the verses. We've got a goat in the verses. A honey sweet goat. A honey sweet goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Wow, Mom, says the quickest verses. Goat kicks fish in the tail fin. Goat wins the verses. The end of the verses of goat versus fish. Jim Adams claims to have been witness to the early verses. But now is the verses. Now is the verses. Now is the verses of goat versus fish. Now is the verses of goat versus fish. Make a verses for goat versus fish. For goat versus fish. New sub! Honey subscribes to Goat vs. Fish. Honey subscribes to Goat vs. Fish. Celebration! Celebration, Honey, for subscribing to Goat vs. Fish. A glorious verses. A beautiful and glorious verses on Goat vs. Fish whenever there is a new subscriber to Goat vs. Fish. Celebration! Welcome, Goat and Fish, to an incredibly short verses of Goat vs. Fish. And a new subscriber for Goat vs. Fish, a new subscriber for Goat vs. Fish on YouTube. Oh, my verses. Look at the beauty of Goat vs. Fish. Look at the beauty of Goat vs. Fish. Never before have you seen a living stream in any place in the universe that is quite so versesly as Goat vs. Fish, quite so versesly as Goat vs. Fish. And Jim Adams can attest, for they have seen the early verses, Those verses were fraught with vigorous debate, and the debate continues on Goat vs. Fish, and the debate continues on Goat vs. Fish. And the debate always continues on Goat versus Fish. Celebration for Skull Goat, who follows Goat versus Fish. Skull Goat. Skull Goat, who follows Goat versus Fish. A goat has been sent via Julian. Celebration for Julian. Celebration for Julian, who sends goat. Skull Goat. Let us hear it for Skull Goat. Let us hear it for Skull Goat. Make some noise for the Skull Goat. Make some noise for the Skull Goat. Scully Goat! Scully Goat! Goat skulls. Skulls will roll this verses. Skulls will roll this verses. Jim Adams is still fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Emily Schultz is still fish. Celebration for fish. It's a new inglorious verses. It's a new inglorious, a new and glorious verses. However you wish to make the calculation, Goat vs. Fish is here for your appreciation, participation, celebration, consternation, infatuation, and deliberation. and deliberation and celebration for goat and celebration for goat. And celebration for goat. And celebration for goat. Fish, John Sai goes fish, celebration for fish. Glorious fish, but we have to start a new verses, goat and fish. It may be a quick verses, but we have to start a new verses. A new verses, goat versus fish. A new verses. Commences. A new verses commences. Now. We said a new verses commences now on goat versus fish, and it's a critical verses. And it's a critical verses and a celebration and a celebration. Are you goat or are you fish? Declarations. Jim Adams says fish. Jim Adams says fish. Celebration for fish. We have Jim Adams the fish. We have Emily Schultz the fish. We have Scully Goat the goat. Scully Goat the goat. And because Scully Goat is a goat and has goat in the name, we get 2 goat in the verses. We get 2 goat in the verses. Scully Goat gets a bonus goat for being goat and for having the name goat, goat. Honey, the new subscriber to Goat vs. Fish, is going with goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. And Goat vs. Fish subscriptions. This is typically for Twitch subscriptions, is what is said. But Goat and Fish, we think we're going to give a bonus goat. We're going to give a bonus goat in the verses of goat for Honey, who has chosen goat. We're going to give Honey a bonus goat. That's a bonus goat for you, Honey. Bonus goat for you, Honey. For subscribing on the YouTube to Goat vs. Fish. For subscribing on the YouTube to Goat vs. Fish with great appreciation from Goat vs. Fish. With great appreciation from Goat vs. Fish. And Wow Mom the goat, the loyal goat, is here for a quick versus. Is here for a very quick versus of Goat vs. Fish celebration. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. And Scully Goat with an on-screen celebration for goat. That's 40 bits for goat. That's 40 verse points for goat. Scully Goat is also claiming to eat spaghetti. You're eating spaghetti on Goat vs. Fish? How dare you? Oh, my verses, a gifted celebration. John Sai changed his name, gifted a verses to fish. Celebration for a gifted verses for fish. Celebration for a gifted verses for fish. A gifted verses for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. A gifted verses for fish. That's fish. And that's a fish scription. That's a fish scription on Goat vs. Fish. Let's get to celebration for fish. Let's get to celebration for fish. Let's get to celebration for fish. Fish scription. Fish scription. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. This fish here. This fish. John Sai changed his name, but still fish, and still with the gifted verses, and appreciation from Goat vs. Fish. And a huge appreciation from Goat vs. Fish. Yes. Mudmore sitting fancy. Mudmore sitting very fancy. Mudmore on the fence, very offensive to Goat vs. Fish. Mudmore, very offensive to Goat vs. Fish. Fence. Fence, fence, fence. Fence. Fencily fence. Fencily fence. Fencily fence. What is that versus? 30 bits for fence? Boo. TML rules fish. Celebration for fish. Let's talk about a short verses. Let's talk about a short verses. Let's talk about a short verses on Goat vs. Fish. Mudmore now with a unification, now with 30 for unification. But of course, fences like to destroy unifications. Negation. But appreciation for your contribution to the unification of Goat vs. Fish. Goat becomes fish. Become goat, become fish. That can happen on Goat vs. Fish. That can happen on Goat vs. Fish. The shortest verses. The shortest verses on Goat vs. Fish. But before we speak of the shortest verses, let us introduce to you all who have not seen yet the new goat. The newest goat on Goat vs. Fish. Make some noise for the newest goat on Goat vs. Fish. Aww. This goat was attempting to whisper to Goat vs. Fish that if only Goat vs. Fish were to side with the goat, that all of our verses would come true. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Goat, 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 goat. Ah! It's the newest goat on Goat vs. Fish. It's the newest goat. It's the newest goat. You need a goat plushie? Yes! Celebration goat. We need more goat. We need more goat and fish. You can mail Goat vs. Fish. If you have a goat or a fish or even a fence sitter that you want to appear on Goat vs. Fish, try mailing it to Goat vs. Fish. Who made that crochet goat? Who made that crochet goat? An excellent verses, wow, Mom. And we do know who made the crochet goat. We do know who made the crochet goat, but we must do some investigation on Goat vs. Fish. We must do an investigation on Goat vs. Fish. We must do an investigation on Goat vs. Fish. Investigation. Investigation on Goat vs. Fish. Investigation. Investigation on Goat vs. Fish. Investigation. Investigation. Goat vs. Fish. Investigation. One more verses of investigation on Goat vs. Fish. Investigation. Goat vs. Fish. Investigation. On Goat vs. Fish, we really should have done the investigation. Fish vs. Cat, false verses. Fish vs. Cat is a false verses. Don't give us Fish vs. Cat and Goat vs. Fish. Fish vs. Cat, false verses. Goat vs. Fish. Wow Mom wants to know. Wow Mom wants to know. Wow Mom wants to know. From whence comes the goat? From whence comes the goat? And we do have the verses. We do have the verses. Let us ponder this. Was it Los Angeles Comic-Con for Goat vs. Fish? It was Los Angeles Comic-Con for Goat vs. Fish. So let's have a look at that verses. Goat vs. Fish. 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 Here's the verses. It's Sanji Cat, Goat and Fish. It's Sanji Cat. It's Sanji Cat, Goat and Fish. So it seems that cats have entered the verses. Cats for goat, cats for goat. Cats for goat. Goat vs. Fish shall link you to the verses. The link is in the chat, Goat and Fish. The link is in the chat. The link is in the chat, Goat and Fish. How fast can be a versus? How fast? How quick can be a versus of Goat vs. Fish? Let us have a very quick versus of Goat vs. Fish. At first versus, the quickest versus of Goat vs. Fish is Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish. That's a versus. That's a versus of Goat vs. Fish, and it's a very quick versus of Goat vs. Fish. The Uber Kitten, are you goat or are you fish? Mudmore had a dream of goat, but it was underwater and there was seaweed and we smoked it. Celebration for the grass of the land and the weed of the sea. Encore. Goat versus fish. But some would say, there can be an even shorter verses of goat versus fish, and even quicker verses of goat versus fish. For it is all well in verses to sing proudly goat versus fish. But what about goat versus fish? Goat versus fish, a faster verses. Let us attempt a timing. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. A faster verse is indeed a faster verses of goat versus fish to simply say goat versus fish. A faster verse is to say goat versus fish. And what if we say quickly goat versus fish? What if we say quickly goat versus fish? Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Faster still is goat versus fish. Faster still is goat versus fish. But what about goat versus fish by implication? Goat versus fish by implication. GVF. 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 GVF, 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 GVF. Goat versus fish. A fast verse is indeed. A fast verse is indeed. A very fast verses of goat versus fish. GVF. So there are many ways for a fast verses of goat versus fish. But what about this verses? And the Johnny Mo says, I am the fence sitter of all fence sitters. And now you see the verses of goat versus fish is going to take much longer because fence sitters insist, wait, before you finish the very quick verses of goat versus fish, what about me? I am the fence sitter of all fence sitters. The repetition. Fence sitter of all fence sitters. Slowing down the verses, slowing the verses. Slowing the verses. Celebration to John changed his name for. Oh, my verses. Wait a verses. Wait a verses. John Sai changed his name, did not just gift a subscription to Goat versus Fish. John Sai changed his name, gifted 12 months of Tier 1 subs to Fish. John Sai changed his name, gifted a year of Goat versus Fish. John Sai changed his name, gifted a year of Goat versus Fish. A year of Goat versus Fish. Now that is a long versus. A long versus. Fence thinks the fence is long. John Sai changed his name, gifted a Tier 1 subscription, a year of tears, Goat and Fish. A year of tears. A year of tears. Celebration. Jim Adams, we'll see you next verses. A year of tears to Goat versus Fish. A year of tears for Fish. John Sai, are you still in the verses? That is a beautiful verses to Goat versus Fish. A year of Goat versus Fish. The consistency of Goat versus Fish. The consistency of Goat versus Fish. The consistency of Goat versus Fish. What a beautiful verses. The consistency of Goat versus Fish. What a beautiful verses. And look at the fish. Look at the colorful fish. Look how Goat versus Fish. Do you enjoy the color changing fish? Do you enjoy all these color changing fish? Goat versus Fish enjoys the color changing fish. Goat versus Fish enjoys the color changing fish. Goat and Fish is Goat versus Fish coming through smoothly, coming through Goat versus Fish. You like that versus? Yes. We are just adding more to Goat versus Fish. We are just adding more to Goat versus Fish. We're adding more verses to Goat versus Fish. New ways to experience Goat versus Fish. Glorious celebration, glorious celebration. Even if it is fish, and it is fish. And it is fish. How's this for a quick versus? How's this for a quick versus? Want to see a quick versus, Goat and Fish? Watch this. Watch this versus. Quick versus. Quick versus. Goat vs. Fish will be TikTok starfish. Celebration, no channel. Welcome to Goat vs. Fish. Yes. Soon, Goat vs. Fish will be streaming on TikTok as well. We are getting used to the vertical verses. We're getting the vertical verses in verses. We are getting the vertical verses in the verses. We are streaming widely on Twitch and vertical verses on YouTube's Rainbow Fish Rave. So Goat vs. Fish, we are learning and discerning. We are learning and discerning that even in a short verses such as this, that it can be a tall verses. It can be a tall vertical verses of Goat vs. Fish. It can be a tall vertical verses of Goat vs. Fish. Imagine you are doom scrolling through YouTube and you find Goat vs. Fish in your vertical verses. Oh, what auspiciousness, oh, what auspiciousness. Are you goat or are you fish? Zoomers will learn about the verses. Zoomers will learn about the verses. No channel. Are you goat or are you fish? But when you want to talk about quick verses of Goat vs. Fish, look at this. Speed verses. Speed verses. Fast verses. Fast verses. Fast verses. Faster, Goat and Fish, faster! Faster, Goat and Fish! Some say that Goat and Fish can verses so fast that you cannot even perceive how quickly they verses. Did you see it? Did you see the verses? Watch again. Did you see the verses? Did you see the verses? So fast is the verses of Goat vs. Fish. No one can escape the verses. No one can escape the verses. So fast is Goat vs. Fish, and no channel goes Goat. Celebration for Goat. Celebration for Goat. No channel Goat goes Goat. Celebration for Goat. Celebration for Goat. Goat. Celebration for Goat. Goat and Fish. Twitch keeps giving Goat vs. Fish new goals for the subscriptions of Goat vs. Fish, and we have here now 161 out of 170 Goat and Fish. 161 out of 170 Goat and Fish. It was not many verses ago, it was not many verses ago. It was not many verses ago that Goat vs. Fish was sub 100, but now Goat vs. Fish decimation that verses. Now Goat vs. Fish decimation that versus celebration. And Goat vs. Fish asks you, is Goat vs. Fish coming through choppity in the verses? Does Goat vs. Fish seem choppity to you? Choppity Goat vs. Fish? Choppity visualization on Goat vs. Fish? Because we are doing some very powerful verses here. We are doing some very powerful verses. Some very powerful verses. No choppity, says Mudmore. No choppities. Celebration, appreciation. Celebration and appreciation, Goat and Fish. Short verses, brief verses. Wow Mom has entered the verses. Wow Mom has entered the verses with the brief verses. Wow Mom says, Goat kicks Fish in the tail fin. Goat wins the verses, the end. But Goat vs. Fish wants to hear from you. Type it out in the chat now. Type it out in the chat now. Be you on YouTube or on Twitch, Goat and Fish. Type it out now. The fastest verses. John Ray, are you goat or are you fish? The fastest verses. The fastest verses. John Ray votes fish. Celebration for fish. We've got to vote for fish. We've got to vote for fish. No channel says goat is the fastest. A contradiction. Fish baby. The fastest verse. Explain the verses to Goat versus Fish. Explain the verses to Goat versus Fish. Describe the quickness. Use your imagination, Goat and Fish. Well, Mom has said that the fastest verses is Goat kicks Fish in the tail fin, Goat wins the versus the end. This is what they say. What do you say to Goat versus Fish? What's the fast verses? What's the fastness of the verses? John C. changed his name with 12-month gifted subscription to Fish. 12 months to Fish. Celebration. 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 Are you goat or are you fish? Of course, Goat versus Fish can be a very fast versus, but so too can Goat versus Fish be a very slow versus, as we know. And we enjoy a nice slow versus because we like a nice long versus of Goat versus Fish. Some of us like it long and slow. And there will be verses for long, slow verses of Goat versus Fish. Long, slow verses. So slow is the verses. Are the Goat and Fish even moving towards one another? Some are not even certain if the Goat and Fish are even versing. So slow is the verses, so slow is the verses. Are the Goat and Fish even slowing? And look how the eyes of the Goat and Fish become the eyes of Goat versus Fish. So slow is the verses. But there can also be fast verses of Goat versus Fish. Work in 1984, welcome to Goat versus Fish. How slow can you go? Work in 1984, welcome to Goat versus Fish. Working slow, versing hard, or hardly versing. Work in 1984. So we enjoy the nice slow verses, but Goat versus Fish is also about fast verses. A verse is so fast that it can scarcely be perceived. A verse is so fast it can scarcely be conceived. A verse is so fast that within one verses of Goat versus Fish, there could be 1,000,000 verses. Work in 1984, are you Goat or Fish? A verse is so fast that within the verses could be 1,000,000 verses. A verse is so fast that within the verses, there could be 2 verses. Within the verses, there could be 5 verses. Within the verses, there could be 60 verses. Within the verses, there could be 6,000 verses. Within the verses, there could be 100 verses. Within the verses, there could be 116 verses. Within the verses, there could be 48 billion verses. Work in 1984 goes Fish, celebration for Fish. Work in 1984 goes Fish, celebration for Fish. Imagine that, 47 billion trillion verses. An infinite verses of verses within of single verses of Goat versus Fish. Work in 1984 Fish, celebration for Fish. Indeed, the verses are so fast that we cannot even perceive all of the verses of Goat vs. Fish. If we verse hardly and closely, and with specific instrumentation, then we can perceive very short verses of Goat vs. Fish. But can we perceive all the verses of Goat vs. Fish? Can we perceive every one of the shortest verses of Goat vs. Fish? Perhaps. Goat and Fish, you cannot. Goat vs. Fish can perceive all the verses of Goat vs. Fish, yes. Goat vs. Fish, the goatfish can perceive all the verses. Goat vs. Fish, the goatfish has perceived all the verses, and we shall perceive all the verses again. It is our perception. Goat vs. Fish does not claim to know all things, for we do not know if you are goat or if you are fish until you tell Goat vs. Fish. But Goat vs. Fish perceives Goat vs. Fish in all things, and Goat vs. Fish perceives Goat vs. Fish, the smallest and shortest Goat vs. Fish, the longest and tallest Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish perceives every verses of Goat vs. Fish. We perceive the verses. And though goat and fish, such as you, and especially not fence-sitters, they think they can perceive Goat vs. Fish, but they scarcely perceive. They scarcely perceive themselves, much less Goat vs. Fish. Some verses are easy to perceive and others not so much, but just be verseful, Goat and Fish. You may have FOMO. You may have fence of missing out. You may have fence of missing out. What about all the verses that I never perceived? What about all the verses I never perceived? What about all the verses I never perceived, Goat vs. Fish? I missed the verses. I missed the verses. But you are here now with Goat vs. Fish. Be verseful that you are perceiving Goat vs. Fish. Even now you are perceiving Goat vs. Fish on the live living streams of Goat vs. Fish. You are perceiving Goat vs. Fish, and what a beautiful verses it is, and what a beautiful verses it is. And Goat vs. Fish perceives you, Cryptid 51. And Goat vs. Fish perceives you, Work in 1984. And Goat vs. Fish perceives you, Wow Mom. And Goat vs. Fish perceives you, John Ray. And Goat vs. Fish perceives you, the Uber Kitten. And Goat vs. Fish perceives you, TMLZ Rules. Don't let the fence of regret surround your verses. If you surround your verses with the fence of regret, then you will not be able to perceive even less Goat vs. Fish. Fences obscure your vision, fences obscure your perception. The more you regret not perceiving Goat vs. Fish, the more you fence yourself. So thick become the fences that they obscure your perception even further. You regret the verses of Goat vs. Fish you have not perceived, that you cannot perceive Goat vs. Fish even when Goat vs. Fish is versing right here, right now on Goat vs. Fish. Some of you, while you are watching Goat vs. Fish now, you may be regretting that you missed the last verses of Goat vs. Fish. You may be regretting that you're going to miss a future verses of Goat vs. Fish. This fence prevents you from perceiving Goat vs. Fish, even the shortest of verses, even the shortest of verses. And oh, you flatter Goat vs. Fish when you want more Goat vs. Fish. You flatter Goat vs. Fish when you want more Goat vs. Fish. And by the verses, Goat vs. Fish, these verses of Goat vs. Fish that Goat vs. Fish is giving to you now. Yes, we have had marbleization races on Goat vs. Fish. And of course we are counting the goat and fish. And we are having polls on Goat vs. Fish. And we are having musications on Goat vs. Fish. And we are having gamifications on Goat vs. Fish. And we are having the Wheel of Verses on Goat vs. Fish. But let us remember, Goat and Fish, to get back to basic verses. You want to hear the verses of Goat vs. Fish. You want to hear the verses of Goat vs. Fish, and that is why Goat vs. Fish is telling you the verses of Goat vs. Fish. It is the verses of education. We tell the verses to you now. We tell the verses to you now, so you can understand the verses of Goat vs. Fish. So you can understand the verses of Goat vs. Fish. So you can understand the verses of Goat vs. Fish. So you can communication the verses of Goat vs. Fish to other goat and fish. So you can communicate the verses of Goat versus Fish to Goat versus Fish. And so you can relaxation and just enjoy the sound of Goat versus Fish telling you all about Goat versus Fish. You can sleep to Goat versus Fish. You can while away the verses just listening to Goat versus Fish. And though at any verses we may call upon you and ask the one true question, are you goat or are you fish? And yea, you will be compelled to answer Goat versus Fish. But you may also ponder the verses within. Yes, we enjoy your participation of Cryptid51, who declares goat, and yea, we declare goat loudly for all to hear, and yea, we declare goat and fish loudly for all to hear, so it becomes clear that it is goat versus fish. But it is also a valid verses to meditation upon Goat versus Fish. In relaxation, listening to the living stream of Goat versus Fish, and you hear the soothing, the grooving, the behooving one true question, are you goat or are you fish? And you think to yourself, what a wonderful verse! You think to yourself, goat. You think to yourself, fish. And in that satisfaction within, the satisfaction within, that can never be comprehension by a fence sitter who sits on the fence choosing neither goat nor fish. A warm verses of satisfaction rolls across your whole corporeal form. And you feel what it is to be goat, and you feel what it is to be fish, and you feel what it is to be versus fish, and you feel what it is to be versus goat, and you feel what it is to be goat versus fish. And you begin to perceive yourself more clearly, grooving and behooving on Goat versus Fish. And you feel that verses, and you are so verseful. You say, I am so pleased that I am here to perceive Goat versus Fish. I am so pleased that I was here to hear the one true question being asked again. Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or are you fish? And this verse is that you have perceived your whole perception of this whole verses. Your perception of this whole verses may seem to have already been ended in the blink of a perception. But that is just the passage of Goat versus Fish. That is but the passage of Goat versus Fish. That is but the passage of Goat versus Fish. And if Goat versus Fish were not to pass, if Goat versus Fish were not to pass, then it would be a fence sitter sitting on their ass. Yes, the verses they come, yes, the verses they go as the goat and fish verses to and fro. And yes, the verses begin, and yes, the verses end. And maybe goat and fish, you make a new friend this verses. But we appreciation the beginning of Goat versus Fish. We appreciation the end of Goat versus Fish when a verses does end, even though there are infinite verses within Goat versus Fish and there's no true end to Goat versus Fish. But the verses may end, but the verses may end. And we are appreciation for that verses, even as we may long for verses past. We may long for verses past. Oh! We may long for verses past. We may long for the verses that ended. But that's okay. For you can verses another day, and you may even verses another way. This has been a short verses of Goat versus Fish. New verses. This has been a short verses of Goat versus Fish. A short verses of Goat versus Fish. A short verses of Goat versus Fish. And Goat versus Fish continues. consider exclamation tip to make a contribution to Goat vs. Fish for a giant chalkboard of Goat vs. Fish, or even as Goat vs. Fish sermonization to you. What if there was a chalkboard of Goat vs. Fish and we could be making it written all these verses? GoatVsFish.edu, education, education, and celebration. For M. Robert Kopp, who follows Goat vs. Fish. M. Robert Kopp, who follows Goat vs. Fish. M. Robert Kopp, are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or 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 fish? And Robert Kopp with their first message is goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Goat, goat, goat. Goat, 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 goat. Goat, goat. Goat, 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 goat. Goat, goat. Goat, 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 goat. M. Robert Kopp, what brings you to Goat vs. Fish? What brings you to Goat vs. Fish? What brings you to Goat vs. Fish? And how do you versus that fish? How do you versus that fish? Cool background, yes. The backgrounds are just getting ever cooler on Goat vs. Fish, ever cooler on Goat vs. Fish. How about that versus? That's a fun versus. It's a very fun versus. Goat vs. Fish brings me to Goat vs. Fish. A very wise versus, a very wise versus. A very wise versus. Very wise versus. Very wise versus. A very wise versus. I see goats climbing trees, fish swimming in seas. I see them verse, which one verses first? And I ponder to myself, what a wonderful verse. I see skies of blue and seas of white, light-breasted verses and dark sacred night. But I know to myself, there's no black or white, there's only a wonderful verse. Oh, the colors of the verses, so pretty in my eye, are also on the faces of goat and fish that are versing by. I see goat and fish shaking fins, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I versus you. I hear spawns a cry, kids leaping to and fro. They'll versus much more. than I'll ever know. And I ponder to myself, oh, what a wonderful verses. Yes, I ponder to myself, what a wonderful verse. What a wonderful verses. What a wonderful verses, Goat and Fish. Speaking of wonderful verses, Goat versus Fish now has to be versing to a place called Licorice Pizza in Los Angeles so that we can attend the Radioactive Chicken Head's 30th anniversary celebration presentation. And we think Goat versus Fish should be there. Applause for Goat versus Fish, applause for Goat versus Fish. Mudmore just continued their subscription. Mudmore with a subscription to Goat versus Fish. Mudmore with the continued subscription to Goat versus Fish. A very limited and provisional celebration for the fence. Aww. Celebration for Mudmore continuing their gifted verses to Goat versus Fish. Yes, Goat and Fish, we may have hundreds of subscribers now on Goat versus Fish, but many of them are gifted verses. But when you continue your subscription on Goat versus Fish, that's a wonderful verse. That's a wonderful verse. Goat versus Fish. We want 100 subscribers on Goat versus Fish. Not just the gifted verses. We want 100 true subscribers to Goat versus Fish for 3 consecutive months of Goat versus Fish. And then we can application to get a 60-40 split on Goat versus Fish, and that would be a fine versus. More for Goat versus Fish, more for Goat versus Fish, more for Goat versus Fish! Very provisional to Goat versus Fish. Very provisional verses. Provisional verses. M. Robert Kopp, we provide for you now the social links to Goat versus Fish. Please follow Goat versus Fish on all social media at Goat versus Fish. On all social media at Goat versus Fish. So the verses has come. The verses has come for a radiation. It's already time for a radiation on Goat versus Fish. We told you it would be a fast versus. We told you it would be a quick versus on Goat versus Fish. We told you it would be a quick versus on Goat versus Fish. We told you it would be a quick versus on Goat versus Fish. More verses, says the Uber Kitten. And the goat got some verses, and so did the fish, and the goat got some bits in the verses, but subscription, Goat and Fish. John Sai changed his name, the fish. Gifted a 12 months of Tier 1 subscriptions. To Fish? 12 months to Fish? Goat and Fish, we're giving this verses to Fish. Fish by default. Fish win the verses. Fish win the verses. Fish win the verses. 12 months of gifted subscription to Fish. Fish take the verses. Fish take the verses. Fish take the verses. Fish take the verses. It kind of makes you wonder about this goat. This goat trophy that says Goat wins the verses, but it was totally won by Fish, Goat. Sorry, Goat. We float down here with a celebration for Goat. We float down here with a celebration for Goat. Celebration for Goat. Goat afloat, Goat afloat. Goat afloat. A floating goat. So here we had a versus, but then we had another versus. Another versus. We're going to fish. It was a gift to Goat versus Fish. With John Sy. Fish of the verses goes to John Sy. Changed his name. Fish of the verses. Goat versus Fish declares Fish of the verses to John Sy changed his name. Celebration. 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 Goat and Fish now. It is time for radiation. Those of you who versus Goat versus Fish on YouTube, appreciation. Appreciation will